So Mr. David Burke is the current Chief Programs Officer at Team Rubicon, an international non-government organization specializing in disaster response based in California, the USA. In this role, Mr. Burke oversees the strategy, development, and execution of Team Rubicon's disaster service programs. In addition to his role at Team Rubicon, Mr. Burke has served on the boards of National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters and the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation, where he served as the board president. Prior to his move to the nonprofit space, David served nearly 5 years in the Marine Corps as a logistics officer, deploying to Iraq with RCT-8 and to Afghanistan with the 2D Marine Division, separating from active service as a captain. So on behalf of FOGS, thank you so much, Mr. Burke, for joining us here today, and we're really thrilled to have you join us.
Thank you, Lauren. It's good to be here, and just so you know, Marines can't spell. It's the 2nd Marine Division. We just have to leave out the end.
As I was coming to that, I was starting questioning it in my head. So thank you. So yeah, just to kick things off, I'm really intrigued in learning more about your journey to Team Rubicon, and just if you can describe where you've gotten to where you are now through your career's journey to the nonprofit space.
Yeah, so obviously I finished college. I grew up in Iowa, finished at the University of Iowa, and I joined the Marine Corps as an officer. Spent about 5 years in active service as a logistics officer. Stated, trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, largely in drawdown operations in both theaters, just based on the timing of my deployments there. When I transitioned out of active service, I started in the consulting space. I worked in defense consulting in the Washington, D.C. area. Got to see a little more inner workings of the big Department of Defense, working at the Joint Staff Logistics level at our Pentagon, and gained some insight there, and really learned that it wasn't a calling for me. And I read about an organization called Team Rubicon, was repurposing and utilizing the skills and experiences and training that military members that had transitioned out of uniform had earned in their time in uniform, and reached out to the organization. Came on as a volunteer with Team Rubicon, and have worked through different roles across the organization after being hired on in 2013 to where I am today to lead our programs both domestically and internationally.
Now, with your time at Team Rubicon, have you had any experiences yourself with civil-military coordination when you're on the ground addressing these natural disasters, for example?
Yeah, there's been numerous instances of pretty significant civil-military coordination, both here in the United States and our work overseas. My personal on-the-ground experiences have been largely US based, but we've been coordinating, managing operations in countries like the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, in Nepal in 2015 after the earthquake, in Haiti in this most recent earthquake, working with US government resources. And when we think about the US based responses, I think the largest US Defense Support to Civil Authority mission ever was in response to Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico. And there was significant coordination there. Hurricane Harvey, we saw significant coordination of defense support to civil authorities and work across civilian and military agencies and actors. And we can't leave out the last 18 months. COVID has been a significant lift for the whole world, and the US leveraged our military resources pretty significantly to respond to the pandemic. And still today, we are working as a civilian agency supporting Afghan resettlement in the United States, as many Afghan families are resettling here after our government's withdrawal of the military from Afghanistan.
Now, gleaning on some examples you shared, maybe it's the recent earthquake in Haiti or Haiyan, for example. can you possibly share maybe just some lessons you learned while being on the ground there and what you saw personally with the civil military coordination?
And the civil military coordination outside of the United States, what Team Rubicon has learned, what I've experienced, is that we are, as a nonprofit organization, a humanitarian organization that is seeking to serve communities in need post-disaster, we are frequently confused with or assumed to be current military, remaining military, or have some connection to the US government or the US military that just doesn't actually exist today. And it's not, any part of our funding model currently. It's not any part of our operational decision making. But as a US military veteran or former military based organization, the humanitarian space in some countries, specifically in the Philippines, we saw pretty significant misperception of our organization's aims, intent, and origins. And since then, I think over the first 11 years of the organization's operations, we've actually seen a slow shift into a better understanding of where we fit as an organization and how militaries can be leveraged and utilized.
Right. So I think a really important point you bring up is this idea of perception and how that plays a role in the work you're doing. So I want to first ask you, in terms of, if you can kind of maybe explain more about why do you think you were perceived that way when you were in the Philippines? And do you think this has to do with this cross-border US soft power, for example? Being abroad, that this is where you're garnering and getting this maybe sentiment from.
I think it's a pretty there's several variables that have driven here, and you mentioned soft power or the humanitarian portion of military operations. And having served in the U.S. military and the U.S. Marine Corps, I've seen the spectrum that the U.S. military trains to and teaches to, and humanitarian operations are considered part of the military's role. And for better or for worse, most U.S. presence outside of the United States is uniformed presence, and that region by region is looked upon differently depending on the context, what types of activations the U.S. military is doing or has done historically. And in the Philippines, for instance, we're in a portion of the world close enough to current and past U.S. military operations that any indication or connection with military, I believe, was perceived to be assumed military, whether that was true or not. And I don't think, as the organization's grown and developed, we did ourselves any favors. We may have had responders that wore some past military clothing item, something camouflaged, something that did look like a military type uniform, that caused us challenges. So there's absolutely responsibility on Team Rubicon's side. But I think that in addition to those potential errors that we made, there was a broader perception that any connection to or past experience in the military tainted or limited your ability to act as a humanitarian. And I think that on its face is just a false assumption. And we've seen tens of thousands of our military members that have interest in nothing but humanitarian action when they take their uniform off from the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And this makes what comes to mind is another interview I actually did a few weeks back with another American, and what her specialty was discussing the all volunteer nature of the U.S. Army. And she gave me a quote, and it's something she was concerned about. And the quote is saying now the majority of people signing up for the military in the US have one or more family members who are already in the military. And then one third of those have the total there have a parent who's also in the military. And so this is creating a situation where she viewed where the military is separating from the civil society that it's supposed to protect. So do you find that in your experience that could it be true? And if this is a worrying statistic?
I do. It's a very insightful perspective, and maybe I can add some anecdotal information to it. So, the U.S. military, after engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, is returning to a smaller force size, right? Smaller size, smaller numbers. Our veteran population from historical wars where many people had a tighter connection to a military member, whether that was family or friend, many of those populations are reaching the end of their lives. So our World War II veterans, our Vietnam veterans, where the last time we didn't have an all volunteer force, those populations are reaching end of life, and that's shrinking our total military veteran population and the overall connection that veterans have to our civilian society. And it's something that we've seen at Team Rubicon. We are military-based organization. The majority of our staff and volunteers are military veterans, but it's a majority of about 65%. So 35% of our volunteers and our responders are civilian. And that may be a career of service in law enforcement or in fire or in emergency medical services, or a civilian that was drawn to help people post disaster and has now been connected and had the opportunity to experience a connection with military veterans and other people that are closely related to the military. But I do see a growing disconnect between our military and our civilian societies, and it's something that we aim to continue to break down as an organization.
Now, looking ahead a bit, at Team Rubicon, or just from a personal perspective as well, what trends do you think you're seeing or expect to see in the use of military resources to address these humanitarian disasters or natural disasters that are occurring?
Yes, so I think there are significant trends. We have to really understand what's driving those trends. As we are on the heels of some pretty significant global convenings to talk about the climate. The climate change is increasing severity and frequency of disasters, and everyone in the system, Team Rubicon included, wants to see local and regional capacity built. The reality, I think, is that won't happen fast enough to keep up with the pace of change that we're seeing in the climate and the most significant crises that we see around the world. So today, there are very few systems or mechanisms with the same resourcing that our nations around the world have invested in their militaries. So the military is a natural solution for some of these challenges. And it fits that there's big human and equipment resources that can help avert, avoid, or minimize the loss of life and suffering after large-scale disasters or other human-driven crises that are non-conflict related. I think that trend will continue. We'll see military resources used regularly to meet the needs. I think the challenge for maybe for the world is to think about something that's not a military, building the capacity to do that. We at Team Rubicon often say the investment that our militaries make in our young women and men is enormous and should not go unused when they take their uniforms off. There are very few places where you can get the same training, skills, and experiences that you get by serving in the military. That investment, that experience, that skill shouldn't go unused for the rest of a military member's life. Many military members in the United States serve for 3 to 5 years, and they have a whole life ahead of them to apply those skills. In an ideal world, we could find those skills, training experiences, invest in them in a mechanism that wasn't purely military service, and build capacity to meet needs that our changing climate is driving without military intervention. But I think in the 5 to 10 year time horizon, it would be a foolish approach to not leverage what's been built and make sure that we're delivering services meeting humanitarian needs on the scale that we anticipate seeing them based on the trends.
And what do you think about with the U.S. defense spending there? If we have that scenario that you're describing about this ideal world, where would you like to see this money going towards? Would it be more specialization, for example, as you were saying, or what should we do? I guess would be my question.
I may have to. You're going to get me out of depth really quickly, Lauren. I'm certainly not a policymaker, but I do see an opportunity, very future looking, to say, if we are regularly and more frequently using military resources to respond to non-conflict emergencies, how can we reallocate, realign budgets and funding and support to increase capacity at local and regional levels, or identify country level investments that don't have to be the armed services to respond to disasters. It's a natural resource. It exists. It's been in existence. Militaries have been in existence since the start of civilization. I think we're at a point where if utilization of military resourcing becomes more humanitarian assistance focused, there's an opportunity to rethink whether that needs to be the military.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think these issues and more will be dived into even more so at the webinar on Tuesday. But yeah, this is so wonderful. So I think just to conclude here, we have so many wonderful points, and I think, like I said, we'll discuss further on Tuesday. So as my last question to you, do you think that the use of military assets should be more normalized and streamlined into disaster management? And I know you've already been speaking a bit on this, but to further this, if you do agree, can you just further explain what needs to be done to make sure the streamlining can happen best?
So I do agree that in our current state, that the most efficient and effective approach to meeting complex crises or large-scale crises is utilization of military resources. I think in order to streamline and make that as efficient as possible, there are significant investments in understanding, awareness, and breaking down misperception, rebuilding a connection to each agency's core purpose and the capabilities they can provide. But to connect into coordinating systems, I think the challenge will always be the various approaches taken nationally, regionally, and locally to ensure that integration meets each sovereign nation's expectations of serving their populations. And that isn't, there's no one size fits all solution, obviously. So it will take significant lift in training and coordination to ensure that those militaries are acting in accordance with local and national expectations, and those resources can be leveraged to the full extent possible. I think there's too many instances where risk or fear for misperception or a mistake limits the capabilities that are leveraged from militaries. And the reality today is that sometimes that's the only resource that is sufficiently trained, equipped, and funded to meet needs.
What a note to end on here. Thank you so much for sharing. I think, yeah, what you brought to light here to the table is really fascinating. And the work that you're doing with Team Rubicon is so wonderful. I was reading more about the organization and how you're really helping, especially how it's low-income families who are the most affected by these disasters. So I want to thank you for what you're doing at Team Rubicon and for your time today here. And we're so excited to have you continue this conversation on Tuesday. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lauren. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you.